Hey, listeners, I want to let you know about two opportunities with Gotham Writers Workshop. Gotham Writers Workshop has been super supportive to Memoir Nation, and I'm very happy to say that I've actually taken Gotham workshops and I had a wonderful experience. So coming up in March, on March 21st and 22nd, Gotham Writers Workshop is hosting, both on Zoom and in person in New York City, a conference that's really tailor-made for you. It's for memoir writers and for nonfiction writers alike. And the weekend will consist of panels on publishing, Q&A sessions, and agent pitching roundtables in which you'll be able to present your writing directly to literary agents. So to learn more about the Gotham Writers Nonfiction Conference, visit gothamwriters.com/conference. One more time, because it's hard to listen. So listen, I'll go slowly. That's gothamwriters.com/conference. And to sweeten the deal, Gotham is offering you an affiliate code for a discount on their classes. So use code Memoir Nation, all one word, Memoir Nation, at checkout for $40 off your first 6 or 10-week class. Some restrictions apply. And tell them Brooke and Grant sent you.
Hello, brave hearts, memory holders, witnesses, and torchbearers. I'm Brooke Warner, one half of the Memoir Nation show, and I'm here with Grant Faulkner. Though, Grant, maybe we're 1/3 and our guests fill out the rotating third of this show. Either way, though, we're talking about something that I think is a very important and very resonant topic for most memoirists today, and that is courage. And interestingly, Grant, courage hasn't been a specific theme that we've delved into on the show. And I'm sure that's because it's baked into so much of what we talk about. But reading the book Hostage by today's guest, Mimi Nichter, I couldn't help but just see courage all over the place. You know, it's front and center in so many ways. And so I think we have plenty to get into on this topic.
Definitely. And it's interesting that we haven't truly delved into it too much. And I'm thinking right now of our episode with Dani Shapiro, which was, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And she defined voice as courage. And I've always liked that definition of voice. And then I often quote Brene Brown, who said courage comes from the Latin word cor, which means heart. So courage literally means following your heart or speaking from your heart. And I really like those two definitions, especially as a writer, because I don't think of courage as necessarily an act of physical bravery, although obviously it can be. And we often think of it like that, but as a way to look into yourself and express things that have perhaps, always been unsaid or perhaps unknown or unrecognized. And I have to confess that writing a memoir is much more thorny than I anticipated because of the courage it takes. I'm just learning a lot about that now, writing my own. So, Brooke, I know you felt there were various facets of courage you wanted to get into after reading Hostage, so I want to hear more.
Well, first and foremost in the book, Mimi shares that this was a story that she had to wait to write. And the title, lest it be confused with another Hostage book that is out right now, is Hostage, a Memoir of Terrorism, Trauma, and Resilience. It takes place in 1970 when Mimi is 20 years old and she catches a flight home to JFK after spending the summer between her junior and senior year of college on a kibbutz in Israel. And the plane that she's on is hijacked by armed members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, redirected to a remote desert region in Jordan. And the hijacking of Trans World Airlines Flight 741 was a major national event in 1970. Nixon was president. It's really interesting. There's a lot of historical images in this book, including newspaper and Newsweek headlines. Passengers were held on the plane for 6 days. It was very hot, no flushable toilets or running water. But then the majority of the hostages get released, but Mimi and 30 others remain. And in part, the reason that she had to stay was because her captors were convinced that she was an Israeli soldier because she had spent the summer on a kibbutz and had taken a photo of herself actually in a army uniform just for fun. But that kind of ended up being a bit of a problem for her. So that's the backdrop of this story. But I do think it's courageous. And I mentioned this to her in the interview because it's a fraught environment to bring out a book about being a Jewish victim of a hijacking by the PFLP. Tensions are running very high around what's happening in Gaza. even though we're not hearing about it in the news anymore, apparently because we have our own chaos that we have to parse through here every day. But there is courage to wade into a story where Palestinians were the aggressors and how to tell that story. But then there's also the courage to tell the story that she buried for such a long time. I mean, this happened 56 years ago. And she writes in the book about wanting to pack it away, wanting to move on with her life. And also, she learned many years after the fact that she had PTSD, not surprisingly, from the event. And then on top of everything, she comes from a family that just didn't ask questions. Her parents wanted her to move on. There was very little to no processing of the event, which I'm sure compounded the trauma, and created a scenario where this huge and momentous thing that she experienced was kept in a really small space. I was thinking a small but pulsing space inside of her, and now it's out. And it's a really compelling story of what happened. I just really raced through it. It's a fast-paced story.
Yeah, and one of the things she does skillfully and compassionately in the book is to provide historical context for what was happening in 1970 and why the PFLP hijacked 3 planes and rerouted them to Jordan. And Dinty W. Moore, a great writer and teacher and publisher, he wrote in his endorsement of the book that Mimi Nichter's experiences during an airplane hijacking more than 50 years ago show us once again that the past is not the past, but rather a prelude to who we are today. And that's so true, so accurate. And I think this is a good book for someone who doesn't have historical context about the Israel-Palestine conflict to read, because Mimi really puts us inside 1970 and inside her 20-year-old mind. She wasn't particularly political. She is Jewish and was, of course, in Israel spending the summer on a kibbutz, but she was not previously particularly politically aware or even inclined toward international events or politics. She was just a young college student who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But I do think she uses this book as an instrument of compassion. She empathizes with her Palestinian kidnappers once she hears their stories and understands what motivates them. There are women hijackers in particular who explain to her why they hijacked the planes. And Mimi weaves in the story of 2 sisters who are part of the group of captors. And one of them, Layla, tells her the story of how their parents were forced out of their home and land and in Palestine in 1948 during the Nakba. And this is a quote from the book. That was during the events that led to the founding of Israel, when Zionists occupied our land. Thousands of our people were killed and more than 500,000 became refugees in neighboring countries. Our family left suddenly on foot, running for their lives. They fled into Jordan with thousands of other Palestinians, crossing a wide river to escape from harm. My parents brought what they could on their backs and atop their heads, but their arms had to be free to carry Nadia and me. Nadia was only 6 months old. Our older brother, Ghassan, was 7, so he helped by carrying a small bag. And so these exchanges, these stories are eye-opening to Mimi, to say the least. And so she manages to strike what I think is an important balance, not blaming, but not ever suggesting that what happened to her is okay either. And I think that this also just speaks to the power of stories in general.
I agree. It's actually quite a difficult thing to balance. And at one point, she tackles the question of freedom fighter versus terrorist, which of course is an ongoing conversation today. Her captors tell her that they believe that violence is necessary to liberate their people. Layla is the one who you just quoted from the book. And her sister Nadia, in another part of the book, tells Mimi, we're fighting a people's guerrilla war, so we must organize the Palestinian population. We hijacked and blew up the planes to shock the world and call attention to our suffering. Otherwise, we are ignored. Israel is not our only enemy. We are against all imperialists around the world who finance Zionism. And in the book, Mimi is just trying to survive each day, but she's taking in the consequences of what it really means that these people think that she's an Israeli soldier, and she does fear for her life and her safety. And then once she's off the plane, she moves to another location. And at one point, she encounters a poster of a man, head covered in a scarf, standing behind barbed wire and holding a rifle. And the poster says, he is not a terrorist, he is a freedom fighter. And beneath that, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And she writes, as a hostage, I know the PFLP only as terrorists. Freedom fighter sounds more honorable, but calling yourself a freedom fighter cannot justify committing acts of terrorism, or can it?
That's so interesting, Brooke, because she puts this back to the reader to grapple with. And I agree with you that she's achieved with this book, what anyone striving to write a memoir wants to achieve, which is balance. And she tells her lived experience, and there's not an agenda. And if there is one, it's to educate and to provide context. And going back to courage, I want to say a word about Mimi's introduction. She talks about all the reasons that she buried this story, partly because in her family they didn't talk about things, but also because she didn't know where to put this story. She didn't want it to define her. And she also experienced symptoms of PTSD without really understanding what they were at first, fear and exhaustion from just talking about it, from reliving the experience. And I was struck by what she writes, and I'm quoting here. For many years, when my husband and I were on vacation and taking long walks along the ocean's edge, I would reflect on the memoir I planned to write someday. And there's that word, someday, which is why we started Memoir Nation, Brooke, to support people like Mimi who know they have a story to tell and to provide a doorway for that. And I think the courage to tell our stories starts as a little shoot coming out of the soil, and it has to be coaxed in order to grow. But once the roots take hold, it's gathering strength, even in those moments when you're just thinking about writing and not quite doing the work of it just yet. So Mimi really is like so many of the people we work with and in our community, someone who dug in and did the work and who struggled to get here, but with results that are so important. And I can't imagine what would have been lost. Think about it. If she had taken this story to the grave with her.
I know. I thought about that too. And especially since we have a lot of writers in our community who speak to that awareness of running out of time, and they have stories to tell, and stories that start to feel heavier the older you get because you realize that you need to release them before it's too late. And Mimi's story is very, very personal, but it's a profound first-person account, very gripping, very in the moment of what it's like to be a hostage in the middle of an ideological and cultural struggle that you don't fully understand, though, of course, she would come to understand it, as she got older and has lived the life that she's lived. And I liked that the book is a countdown of the days of the hijacking too. Like it happens, day 1, day 2. She gives us an account of what it felt like, who the people were, once again, giving emotion and felt experience to an event. And that just serves a purpose of humanizing everyone who is there. And I feel like, at the end of the day, we ultimately all want the same thing, which is agency, freedom, to be free from fear and annihilation. And Mimi tells these stories, of relating to her captors, of seeing them as people. And of course, the violence playing out in Gaza right now would not and could not happen if the government of Israel were acknowledging Palestinians as humans. You just cannot indiscriminately kill people in the way that they are if you really see the humanity of these people. And we're seeing it here at home with ICE, these agents incapable of seeing the humanity in others. And this was really driven home for me with this book, about heart and heart connection and seeing other people's struggle and being able to step into the experience of others. And, I just deeply admire her for being able to tell the story in that way.
Yeah, we talk so often on this show about how memoir changes lives and saves lives. And I wish we could get more memoirs into the hands of the people holding the power. But I've been thinking so much about what Andre Debus said in our recent episode with him about violence stemming from fear. And we have these leaders. Let's just hypothesize like Trump and Netanyahu, who are stoking fear in order to justify their violent agendas. And so again, back to courage, I admire Mimi's courage to tell this story, and I hope that we all embrace our own courage to keep fighting for the world we want and not the current iteration that's being presented to us as inevitable. So I still believe that stories will continue to be a vehicle toward the future and a better world, Brooke.
Me too. Yeah, me too. So let's take a short break and we will be right back with Mimi Nichter. Hello, listeners. We have been telling you all about the great offerings we have going on at Memoir Nation, which is the online community extension of this podcast. And this time around, we want to tell you about the next class we have coming up, which is part of our monthly series of memoir classes. Sue Williams-Silverman will be teaching a unique and important class, which is called Time at the Speed of Epiphany. Sue is a celebrated memoirist of books such as Lovesick, Because I Remember Terror, Father, I Remember You, and How to Survive Death and Other Inconveniences. And this class is about scene, summary, and reflection, all narrative techniques that memoirists really should master. It will help you be in control of the story you are trying to tell, and there really is nothing more important than that. So this is a class about pacing, storytelling, knowing how and when to speed up and slow down, when to be in a moment, and when to reflect on it. I personally cannot think of anyone better than Sue to teach this class, and we're very excited about this offering. It's happening March 16th at 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern, and we would love to see you there. You can find the details at memoirnation.com. Click on the classes menu, and it will take you right to that class and future offerings, and you can check out who's coming and get excited about it. Thanks so much. Welcome back, everyone. We're so pleased to have Mimi Nichter with us today. Mimi is a cultural and medical anthropologist, public speaker, and professor emerita of anthropology at the University of Arizona. She is the author or co-author of 4 anthropology-related books and the recipient of the Margaret Mead Award and the George Foster Practicing Medical Anthropology Award. Her essays have appeared in HuffPost, Newsweek, and Brevity. Her brand new memoir, Hostage, a memoir of terrorism, trauma, and resilience, was a finalist for the Tucson Festival of Books Literary Award for Nonfiction. Welcome, Mimi.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, we're really happy to have you, and we're excited about this conversation and have a lot of questions for you. So I want to start with the fact that it took you 50 years to write this story of what happened to you when you were 20 years old in 1970, when you were kidnapped by the PLFP and held hostage for more than 20 days. And in your introduction, you explain why it took you so long, but you also mention courage. And I want to call out this line. You write, "As I found courage in telling the story, the desire to write about the experience emerged periodically." And so could you talk about finding that courage? What did it feel like? And how did you eventually find enough courage to write, finish, and publish this book?
Honestly, I think I'm still finding the courage. And I think this is one of my first steps in finding the courage to speak about it openly. This isn't a story that I talked about for most of my life. And the courage came slowly. I mean, I think I processed the story and the meaning of the story to me as I wrote it. And that has its own difficulties because it meant that the fear and the memories and the unpacking of the memories really came slowly. And at first they didn't come deeply, they came visually. And it's because I could see what was happening, but I didn't really attach the feeling to it until later. So I think this book is unusual because I processed along the way. And the courage came through that from, I think, writing a chapter, reading it over, editing it forever, and realizing that it was going somewhere. It was unfolding in its own way.
It took courage to tell the story in the way you told the story. And I'm thinking specifically of a craft technique that you used, telling the story in the present tense and reliving the experience in such a way that you invite the reader right into it. And so to feel the discomfort of those 6 days on your plane and your fear and your hunger, but also your emerging compassion for your kidnappers and your unfolding literal understanding of the events that you find yourself in the middle of. So I'm just curious about that choice of choosing the present tense, and what was it like in your own body to relive those moments in such a way?
Honestly, I wrote it. I did not write it in the present tense. I first wrote it in the past tense. And it wasn't until I had written the whole book, and then one of my writing teachers suggested that I might try writing a part of it, writing the first chapter in the present tense. And when I did that, I realized that it took on a whole different feeling, that suddenly that was a way of really planting the reader in my body and making them feel what I felt. So the immediacy was so much greater in the present tense. So it was challenging. Parts of it were easy to go from past to present tense, but parts of it I really stumbled upon. And even in the copy editing phase, places were pointed out to me that were not done correctly, because you can get really mixed up with how to say certain things in the present tense as opposed to the past. In terms of feeling in my body, as I was saying a few minutes ago, as an academic, I didn't do a lot of writing where I was feeling in my body. So I didn't use the I word in most of my other books, or in the articles that I wrote for journals. We just didn't do that. I mean, now there's been a narrative turn, I think, in anthropology, but for many years it was very formal and inappropriate to really insert yourself in your writing. You could insert your analysis, but not your personal feelings. Or at least that's not, my writing was not very heady, but still was not deep in terms of my own body and my own feelings. And so I had a lot of friends, readers, telling me, well, you need to go deeper. And I would sit at my computer and just wonder, what does that even mean? Where am I going deeper? And because I hadn't processed the story, because I had hidden it away, I didn't have access to those feelings right away. So it really took a couple of months, years, days, moments to get into the feelings. It was layered, but first what came was the actual visual, the visual of the plane, the visual of the people who were holding us hostage, the other characters who were with me.
Well, you really make it come alive, Mimi. And, I asked you about courage earlier. And I also want to tell you that I think it's a brave book, partly because the political environment that we're in this moment in the aftermath of October 7th is so fraught. And it's been devastating, of course, to experience the fallout of all of it, from increasing anti-Semitism to tensions running high among people who are falling into different camps around Zionism and Israel and the number of dead Palestinians. And you walk right into this with a book that is really measured. And I wanted to say, at age 20, you're fairly naive to the circumstances that led to the moment of your capture. And then the way you unpack it all is educational, but also compassionate. So could you talk about how you approached talking about the broader Israel-Palestine conflict in light of October 7th?
By the time October 7th occurred, I was well into the writing and almost completing it. And I had to think a lot about that, because that same divisiveness that I talk about in the book, the othering, the Palestinians who held us from the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, they didn't see me for who I was. I was a college student. I was a radical college student. I was on the streets against the war for Vietnam. We had our own politics, and we were against imperialism. And here I was being viewed as an imperialist. And I wondered, I think, when the first occurred, whether some of the hostages who were taken from Gaza might also, they were young, they were at a music festival, could they possibly also have been of a different mind, not being seen by the Palestinians as the other, as just Israelis, but as Israelis who also cared deeply about Palestinians and were, but I didn't know that. And I think as an anthropologist, I really didn't feel like this was going to be part of my story, because I didn't know enough about it, and it was unfolding as I was writing. And I felt that what was important for me to take away was that I understood something, and perhaps I could offer something of what it meant to be a hostage, because I think there's a lot of similarity, no matter what period of time you are taken hostage, of the inability to have your freedom, of someone dictating who you are and what they think you are, and the complete lack of opportunity to do anything that you want to do, just not knowingness. So I felt all those things. But it was also a very difficult time to try to publish the book because of the divisiveness and the sides that people took immediately. Are you pro-Palestinian or are you pro-Israel, right? There's nothing in between. And as somebody who had been in that situation, I realized there's a lot of in between. I was in between, right? I was in between. I was learning. How do you even know about another country or really the politics of that country unless you've been there? So that was the anthropologist of me seeing that. What I understood, and I thought how my anthropology brought me to, I think, a deeper writing of the book was really thinking about what I'd learned from living in the field, because I'd lived in India for several years with agriculturalists. So when the Palestinians then and now talk about the land and the land that they want and the importance of the land, I could really relate to that because I had lived with people who in India who that was their life, was their land and their trees and their roots. And that was the case for the Palestinians as well, and the feeling that they had and why they wanted to go back to their homeland. So I used that to express my own compassion, but I didn't want to go into Gaza, what was going on in Gaza today. I couldn't find a place for that. I'm not a historian. I didn't want to go deeply into politics.
But you do mention it in the introduction, at least just in passing.
Of course, because it's so relevant,
right?
Because it's an extension of the same story and the same struggle that the Palestinians have faced now for so many years.
Well, maybe I'm interested in the in-between. And I was struck by the female freedom fighters in the book, or terrorists, and you grapple yourself in the book with whether they're one or the other or both. But then you do bond with these women, and they tell you their stories, and you understand what motivates them. And they lost everything in the Nakba in 1948. And then you also bond with the other women who you're being held hostage with. And when there are children still on the plane in the early days, you become a sort of de facto counselor to keep them occupied and to play games with them. And so your gender and being female in this experience gives you a particular perspective. And I wonder if you can share more about this awareness, both in life and in the book.
That is an interesting and multifaceted question. Yes, certainly. The points that you mentioned, Grant, are very relevant to gender. And I think also what I tried to hint at, I think, at the book was the really deep fear that we had. I mean, right from the beginning, I was wearing a mini dress, and that was so inappropriate for a long, for days as a hostage. And all these men who were coming on the plane, the Palestinian terrorists who were coming on the plane with their robes and their, head covered and all that. And I was sitting there with my, with my very, very short dress on and feeling that. And then every time we went down off the ladder and feeling like men were looking up my dress or potentially touching me, just small rub or something like that, it's just very scary, right? And then as they took the men off the plane, when there were only women left on the plane, and then when there were only 5 women left on the plane, and we were all most 4 of us were in our 20s or younger, that was very frightening. So gender in that way was a very troubling thing because we never knew where we were going once we got off the plane and who would be holding us and what kind of situation we could be in. So the threat of potential touching, raping, whatever, was in the background. In terms of gender and caring, yes, that was right from the beginning. There were so many children on the plane. And of course, you couldn't expect children to just sit. And so pretty early on, I bonded with 2 other women who also kind of ran this sort of camp. We called it a summer camp. And one of them was a good singer. So we sang. And so that was an important part, I think, of the gender and caring. And also, once we were in the house, we had to cook after a certain time. And, after a few days, we were cooking ourselves and they would bring us just some provisions. And that was also a gendered activity. So along so many ways, there was the gender division. And then, of course, very interestingly, the male hostages, some of them had been kept separately. When men wanted to come and other men came and wanted to talk to them, Palestinians, the members of the PFLP, they had decided they wouldn't listen to them. They just didn't want to talk about it. However, when these two sisters came to tell us about their plight and about being freedom fighters and not terrorists, we listened and we talked about it and thought about them and who they were. So, yes, gender played a very important role in the hijacking and also in the aftermath. And I think my reluctance to talk about it.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Mimi. It does. It certainly reads, on every page. Practically, you kind of experience that through a gendered lens, and I certainly did. And obviously, an experience like the one that you had in 1970 will change you, and you come home and you feel pretty alienated from your peers and even from yourself. And so, what follows, and this is in your book, but kind of at a high level, is that you follow Mark, who you end up marrying, to Africa, and then you end up living abroad in southern India, particularly for a number of years. So I wonder what insights you gained from writing the book, specifically about the choices that you made in your life after the hijacking. And I was just curious, was there anything revelatory or that you understand now differently for having written the memoir, just in terms of your life trajectory?
Oh, another big question.
We like big questions here.
Well, certainly the traveling opened the door for me from being stuck in the past during my senior year in college when I returned from the hijacking to grounding myself more in the present. And importantly, I learned that through really difficult travel, because we traveled overland through Africa and Asia for 16 months. And I think I learned to trust myself, trust my intuition, and also it honed my observation skills of the world. And I think I applied what I already had learned in my hostage situation to a sensitivity to what I heard and what I saw. And so the traveling itself, which was in some ways very related to the hostage situation because I was a lost soul when I came home, and that helped me get out of it. I think that it paved the way for my work as an anthropologist and my ability to live abroad for many years, and also to live with people, learn their language, and also to learning how to narrate stories, to collect information and narrate stories. And for most of my life, I wrote other people's stories. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until I retired from being a professor that I turned to writing my own story.
That's so interesting. Mimi, I noticed that you're published by the University of Nebraska Press, and I love that because I've published with university presses too, and the University of Nebraska is one of the best. I love it. But I want to ask you about your publishing journey, because sometimes being published on a university press is an indication that the bigger publishers just weren't willing to take a risk on your book. And there's also another book called Hostage recently out, and that one by Eli Sharabi, which tells the story of being held by Hamas for 491 days, and also of the devastation of losing his wife and children on October 7, 2023. So if you would indulge us a bit about your publishing journey, and if you or your publisher had a moment when you saw this other book was coming out with the same title as yours, that must be quite a experience for an author.
Yeah. Well, the first one about the publishing journey. Well, University of Nebraska came first. Potomac came first because they're an imprint and they wanted the book, and that was a good fit. And just about the same day that I got the letter from them, I got an agent. And I've been searching for an agent because as an anthropologist, and I had written 4 books already from university presses. And this book was so different that I really had my eyes set on a, big 5, 6, whatever we call them nowadays, right? Mm-hmm. I wanted something different. Because I'd already been, my first book was published by Harvard. Second one was NYU. I'd been through that. I knew that process. I wanted something, this was a really different book. And I wanted a really different publisher. And so the agent looked around. It was a really bad time to be getting into that, getting into that world of the big presses at that time. I think a lot of them, I'd like to think from the kinds of responses he got that they liked the book. All the responses were positive, but the answers were negative. So at a certain point, I went back. I told the agent, I just saw the writing on the wall. And I just said, they don't know what's going to happen in the world and where this is going to land up and who's going to want to read this. This is just not a story for this day. It's a good story, but not, and maybe they saw the books like Sharabi's book coming to, of course, much more culturally relevant because they're of the moment. So I advised the agent that we should go back to the University of Nebraska, who first wanted me. And I happily did so. And I've been really happy that I did that because they're a great press. So I'm really thrilled that they'll be publishing my book. And I have to believe that a book finds its home.
Mm-hmm. That's my belief too.
Yeah. So I came to that, but it took me a while. And the second part of your question was about Eli Sharabi. And yes, my agent wrote me a note and said, do you know about Eli Sharabi's book that's being published with the same name? And actually, I had gone back to the press even beforehand because I had heard about it because I know people in Israel and they had told me, it was first published in Hebrew. I knew it was coming. And I went back to the press and I said, I'd like to change the name of the book. Right? Because this is going to be a big one. And, everyone wants to know something about the hostages, and his was the first. And they said, no, we don't want to change the name because by the time your book comes out, people won't remember his book.
Interesting.
6 months later when your book comes out, because his book came out on October 7th, people won't have his book top of mind. So at that point, I didn't realize one could really, barter. I could have fought back, but I didn't. I just thought, well, they know what they're talking about. So I just said, okay. And I did read the book, of course, and I felt like even there are moments in his book where he does express the same kind of humanity that I do, particularly at the beginning of his hostage experience. And I also saw in his book the seeds of what could have happened to us. We could have had the same kind of outcome, being held for longer or having devastating, having died there. That was certainly, true. But of course, his book was very sad to me. Of course, to anybody who reads it, So they're very different books written at a very different time. So
Yeah,
I think there's room for both of them, even with the same title. One hopes.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for sharing that. And Mimi, in closing, given that we've been probing courage here with you today, what would you say to a memoirist who has a story to tell, who's maybe been holding it close or locked away, but really wants to do it and feels scared? What are some ways forward to get the work done?
People do call me resilient, and they do call me as a courageous person. I think both for the life that I've led as well as for how I've written about, how I've been able to write this book. But I don't see myself that way. And I never have. I never saw myself as really brave or courageous. And I think that's just, something about how I am. But I think that it's very important to tell our stories now more than ever. When I started this writing, I had never talked about this story much at all, and not even in therapy. And so the courage to begin is something that I think is important first step on the path to healing. And I think there are so many healing journeys, and it takes every step of the way in this process of writing memoir takes courage. And I think especially people who are older, who grew up before the days of trauma being out in the world and being a more easily discussed topic, these kind of stories may be dormant and may even die with the people. And I think the more we can share our stories, the more other people can see themselves in it. I think so many people have experienced so much trauma that because of their courage, they've lived other lives. But it's just as important to look at the things we don't want to talk about, because they do speak to so many. And I haven't found that yet with the book, but I certainly found it when I talked about my brother, when I wrote about him and being schizophrenic. And I found so many people relating to that, and also relating to the fact that they could never speak about it. And so I know that there are so many things in our families that are so important to uncover. So courage along the way, every step is needed. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Mimi. Thanks for writing the book, and thanks for being on the show.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mimi. It was so nice to hear this. So interesting.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
We'll be right back with today's book trend. So, Grant, this trend is an ongoing one that publishing has a gambling problem. A story with this title came out in The Walrus in the fall of last year, and I bookmarked it, and I've come back to it a few times. I wrote something similar in 2020, actually, in an article for Publishers Weekly called The Trouble with Big Deals: Why Huge Advances Aren't Always Huge Wins for Budding Authors. The Walrus piece is written by Taja Eason, and she does an even more thorough job of breaking the whole thing down. And I do think it's an important piece for aspiring authors to read because, reality check, and also because book publishing is a really unpredictable lever, it turns out.
Unpredictable lover, yep. It is the truth. I've experienced that unpredictable lover. When I sold Pep Talks for Writers, my second book, it wasn't a tremendously huge advance, but it was a very healthy advance. It was the biggest advance I've received to this day. And my agent and editor, when we first met, they were talking about spin-offs, a journal, a deck of cards with prompts, all kinds of things, But and I was enough of a rube to think that I'd made it, and that my next book would sell even more and get a bigger advance, and then there would be another book, and maybe I could pay for my kids' college expenses or something with all this money. But yeah, I confess, I was a rube. I haven't received an advance anywhere close to that one, and that was 10 years ago. I think the book has sold, actually, I think it's sold something like 30,000 copies between print and audio.
It's pretty good.
And ebooks. Yeah, it's pretty good. But that's not really enough. And it slowly reached that 30,000 copies. That wasn't like right out of the gate, like most books sell a lot out of the gate. But I've actually gotten quite comfortable publishing with small presses and university presses. And my recent book, Something Out There in the Distance, it's a different book because it's both a photo book and a type of novel or story. And it just absolutely, I'm convinced, would have been lost at a big publisher. They wouldn't have wanted it to begin with. I knew that. But if they'd taken it, they also just wouldn't have treated it with the loving care that the University of New Mexico Press did. So in the end, I'm quite happy with my publishing journey, and I don't think of the big presses too much. In her Walrus piece, Eason writes, "What's undeniable is that the market has become harder to break into for writers whose work does not scream commercial." And I think my work doesn't only not scream commercial, it doesn't really even whisper it. But I think there's an irony there, because I think my latest book might sell well because it doesn't scream commercial. I think people are drawn to the authentic and the different and the original.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And I agree. And I think this is where, the big five mirrors Hollywood in a lot of ways, whereas the indie presses are like indies. There is a total parallel to Hollywood in that way. And so, we can see also that there are fewer risks in film when you're getting into the big studios. Great movies are being made, but a lot of those are by smaller outlets or because there's a champion attached to them who greenlights the project. But by and large, in book publishing, there is so much aversion to risk on the one hand. It's always been true. And yet big publishers will throw down huge advances for certain authors who never have a hope or a prayer of earning out. And then what's troubling to me, and always has been, is that those authors can become pariahs, and then they can't sell their next books. And this is really detrimental to the careers of many authors who take too big of an advance and then have their publishers sour on them. But it's a system that is not set up to behave or act differently. No author gets an offer of a giant advance or goes to auction and then says, actually, no, never mind. I'm going to go with a smaller publisher who's offering me a fraction of what you are. But in fact, some authors really would be better off doing so.
Yeah, that's the irony. But yeah, if I get the big meeting with the big five person, I'm going to take it. Take
the $200,000.
But I also, just going back to the Walrus piece, I appreciated the explanation of sales track. And she writes, this is quoting her, sales track, or simply track in industry parlance, is an invisible force shaping contemporary literature. Track shapes how an agent pitches a book and how editors assess whether to buy it. Track restricts reader choice by dictating which books are served up as the next big thing, and the next, and the next, and by kneecapping writers deemed insufficiently commercial. The primacy of track, in other words, is a barometer for the health of a literary culture. However, she writes, track is like credit. It might be better to have none at all. So, Brooke, do you concur with this assessment that it might be better not to have any track at all?
Yes, because if you have a book that is not performing well, you have a poor track record, then it does mean that you will be unlikely to sell your next book to a publisher for an advance. It doesn't mean that you can't or won't sell the book, but authors saddled with underperforming books are basically forever in purgatory because you can't not be attached to that number. And editors can see that underperformance, and then they're just not incentivized to take a chance on those authors, or especially to give them a second chance, which is really sad because oftentimes it's those second, third, fourth books that authors write that do the best.
Every time I tell that to people, they're like, wait a minute, don't you get better? Write us a better second book and get a second chance. But yeah, not a lot of the time. And, there's another piece in LitHub related to all this from it was published last November, and it was written by Maria. I'm going to give an attempt at this name. Please forgive me, Maria, if I don't hit it, but Maria Kuznetsova, who shares her story of exactly what we're talking about. She got it's a riveting story, actually, her essay, so you should read it. But she got a $160,000 advance for a book that went on to sell only 10,000 copies. And her editor passed on the follow-up book after that, basically telling her it wasn't a good follow-up book, even though Maria knew it was better written. So that personal piece in LitHub is coming to terms with the fact that she may never get to publish again. Or maybe she should go the route that I did and kind of more focus on more university presses and mid-sized presses. So I'm curious, Brooke, from your position as a publisher of a hybrid press, do you get many authors like Maria coming to She Writes Press to publish?
I wouldn't say many, but we do have some. We have authors who have been disenchanted by traditional publishing for sure, and many countless who have been rejected when they know that they have worthy books. And so they understand that they're being rejected for reasons of commerciality or lack thereof, which is already subjective in the first place, or because they simply don't have the platform or the existing audience. And I thought another interesting point that Maria makes in that piece is about earning out. She wrote that 20 to 30% of books earn out their advances. Sometimes authors will suggest to She Writes Press, like when they're coming to me, that hybrid publishing is problematic in some way because there's no guarantee that they'll earn back their investment. Mm-hmm. To which I say, like, there is no guarantee anywhere that you're going to earn back your money in book publishing, and anyone who says that you will is not telling the truth. And in this way, book publishing is always a gamble. And that's where I agree with Eason, that publishing has a gambling problem because in the way it places its bets, right? Like it'll have a whole bunch of books and like some books just get all the money. But I also can't foresee, which books are going to earn out or which books are going to turn a profit at the point of acquisition. There are too many unknowable factors, and it's certainly not based on the quality of the writing alone. So after reading that piece by Maria that you mentioned, which is called "The Publishing Industry Gambled on Me and Lost," my advice to authors in her situation is don't give up. There are other ways to publish. You can find your way out there for sure. And it's disheartening to get dropped by your publisher, yes, but there's also a really exciting and thriving publishing ecosystem beyond the big five, as we have talked about so many times before, Grant.
Yeah, back to the unpredictable lover analogy maybe, but I think it's a little bit like romance, find the partner that's right for you and allows your voice to truly shine, whether it's commercial or not. And the main thing is that your voice is in the world and that it's supported and out there shining. And that's what we try to do here at Memoir Nation. So we thank you for tuning in, and we hope you sign up for memoirnation.com, one of our plans there. You can do a free plan if you want. And also crucial, invite your friends to join you, because I know of no better way to find your voice and believe in your voice than in a community of encouragement. So thank you, and we'll see you next week.